Hello. Today we are going to be looking at the work of David Harvey. Primarily we are looking at his work where he spatializes Marx's Capital and Marx's other works. And I'm going to be working with two books, the first one being Limits to Capital. But first let's take a brief look at what's the context in which David Harvey is writing. So David Harvey is born in 1935, and why is that date significant? I think it's what it tells us is that David Harvey has lived through the Second World War. He's seen several economic booms and busts. He's seen the COVID crisis, and he continues to reflect today on the various ways in which capitalism manifests, attempts to resolve crises, and how it reshapes our global world. I think it might not be quite far removed from the truth to say that David Harvey is one of those geographers whose work is read widely across the social sciences and humanities. His work contributes to social theory as well as to literary theory and much more. While there are several other scholars such as Eric Swindigo, Doreen Massey, Neil Smith, who have also worked towards spatializing Marx's theory and together collectively have contributed to what we call as the spatial turn in social theory, I think David Harvey stands apart in the way how widely read his work is and how significant in understanding contemporary global problems related to capitalism is. So let's begin looking at David Harvey. He, in fact, one earlier time, in 1959, he came up with his book Explanation in Geography. And Explanation in Geography itself caused a revolution in the discipline of geography by bringing in more of a quantitative revolution into what was then a descriptive discipline. Then in 1973, he writes Social Justice and the City, and 1982, he writes The Limits to Capital. That's the book that I'm going to speak about today. David Harvey has also been teaching Marx's Capital for more than a decade now, and I've given a link on this slide. If any of you are interested in reading Capital along with David Harvey, that's the link to go to. Then in 1989, David Harvey writes The Condition of Postmodernity, another very influential book, especially across the disciplines of architecture, social theory, and literary theory. And in this book, he introduces the term time-space compression, primarily also to look at what he, following Fredric Jameson, argues that postmodernism is primarily the logic of late capitalism. And nothing new, just the same thing, but a different wrapper, disguised differently. We are not going to be talking about that book in this course, but I just wanted to give you a sense about it. He's written much more than I have listed on these slides. I didn't want to clutter it, but I'm also presenting one of his more recent works that is called The Enigma of Capital, where he takes contemporary world events and discusses what in Limits to Capital was a very abstract way of explaining capital, since it was a theoretical intervention. He takes that and he also explains that using world history and geographical shifts. So I thought it would be easier for the class to grasp ideas of spatializing Marx, but using examples. So let's begin with this example that he himself gives. In fact, David Harvey starts talking about these spatial shifts for us by giving us the example of Haussmann's Paris. So in Second Empire Paris, when we saw a lot of political, social and economic strife, Haussmann was called in to reorder Paris, right, with wide roads and boulevards and a lot of modern kind of buildings. He reshaped Paris, and that was an attempt to resolve the crisis that was there in Paris at that time. Then Harvey moves on to post-Second World War US, and there he talks about the intense focus on infrastructure. The investment in infrastructure mainly led by debt financing, but you see alongside the highways coming up, the national parks coming up, and an increasing suburbanization where easy loans were given primarily in the beginning to white working class populations, but then eventually capital, we know, needs to expand and it needs to accumulate more and more, and in that expansive kind of drive to a much wider section of the United States population, leading to some people being almost pushed into taking credit and debt, and therefore eventually leading to what we now know as the 2007-2008 subprime mortgage crisis, when people are unable to pay off their loans and their homes were foreclosed, taken over by banks. Now this process, he says, begins in the southwestern part of United States, but eventually makes its way across the globe. In the map that I have up here, what we are trying to show is how and to what extent different parts of the world were affected by the 2007-8-9 economic crisis. And what you see here is the degree to which each one of these places is getting affected. So we'll take one small example here, in fact two. So for example, in the United States, when homes are getting foreclosed, there is an economic crisis, quite obviously consumer demands are going to fall. So consumer demands were an all-time low, and who is the supplier for a large amount of commodities to the United States? China. So China saw in fact a huge reduction in commodities being purchased by the United States, and it is also said that about 30 million people in China lost their jobs at this point in the crisis. Capitalism, we know from Marx, keeps coming to successive crises because of the internal contradictions within the structure of capital itself, right? And then there are different strategies used to resolve these crises. So China also attempts to move sectorally and then geographically in order to resolve the crisis at its end, and therefore it starts putting in a huge amount of capital into infrastructure development. So China becomes a large producer of cement. It is in fact produces 50% of the world's cement, large amounts of metal reinforcements, and a whole lot of things that are used in the construction industry. A lot of it was used within China, but then not all of it can be used within China. Another example here is that of the reduced demand from oil countries, because of which there was lesser amounts of jobs in the Gulf countries, and that impacted especially Kerala in India, from where a lot of migrants go to the Gulf region for work. So you see how something that began at one moment in history, in one part of the world, finds its way to other parts in the globe, right? That's primarily what Harvey is trying to show us in a theoretical way in Limits to Capital. So let's come back to Limits to Capital. And one thing that Harvey wants to remind us in this work is that capital is not a thing. Capital is a process, right? Capital, from what Marx tells us of the laws of motion, moves around, right? Capital has different circuits. So Harvey takes Marx's very elegant equation of MC, C prime, M prime, and kind of starts zooming into and detailing several parts of these circuits, right? So there are several things he does here. One way he looks at it is the primary circuit, which he says is the production circuit, the secondary circuit is the circulation circuit, and the third circuit is the valorization, where you are able to retrieve the surplus labor after selling the commodity. So that's the valorization circuit. So there are these different circuits. He also goes into further detail to talk about circuits such as the investment in science and technology, and therefore better machineries, and then how that plugs back into the circulation of capital. I'm not going to go too much into that, but from this diagram that I've taken from the Limits to Capital, and David Harvey in fact cites Desai 1979 for this particular diagram, he explains three other circuits. One is, obviously all of them are integral, they're not really separate, but you can read them differently. So there is a circuit of money capital, there is the circuit of productive capital, and there is the circuit of commodity capital. Of these, the circuit of money capital, and here money could include various forms, right? The fictitious capital or credit. So the money capital is the most mobile, is the most easiest to move around the globe. And this is something we see even in our everyday transactions, right? Money is an easier thing to move around, easiest out of the other lots. The production circuit, for example, which includes investment maybe in land, it includes investment in heavy machinery, in infrastructure, it also includes labor, finds it very difficult to move around. These are more fixed capitals, right? These are not easy to move around as much. The third circuit, that is the circuit of commodity, is relatively easier, not as easy as money, but relatively easier to move around, but it takes time and there is efforts involved in moving commodities around, in valorizing through sale of commodity into producing surplus value. So these three different circuits move at different paces, have different levels of mobility, and therefore in the way they are integrated into the circuit of capital, into the laws of motion of capital, there are several inherent contradictions that emerge, and these contradictions lead to crisis at various moments. So let's take a pause and for a minute read one of the quotations from David Harvey's Limits to Capital. He writes, "Capitalism is highly dynamic and inevitably expansionary. Powered by the engine of accumulation for accumulation's sake and fueled by the exploitation of labor power, it constitutes a permanently revolutionary force which perpetually reshapes the world we live in. How can we represent and analyze the complex dynamics, the inner laws of motion of the capitalist mode of production?" That has been Harvey's project, right? How do we understand? And he also, towards the end of the lecture, you will see, gives us a spatial vocabulary which helps us make sense of these laws of motion as they move around time and space. Then he takes from Marx another very interesting method, and that we refer to as the cut. I mean, Marx refers to it as the cut. I think if there's anybody here from architecture, will understand it much more easily, because we can use the metaphor of a section, the architectural section here, to understand what a cut is. You take your object of analysis, and remember here, even though we are taking capital, the object is not like a thing, it is a process, right? And then you cut through it from various angles, you get a section, and that gives you an idea of what is happening in that cut. That is, what is happening in that particular section. So a cut is that, and Marx in his work in Das Kapital actually takes two cuts to understand capitalism. His first cut is in the production process, where he looks at capitalism's internal contradictions within the production process, such as the falling rate of profit, the law of diminishing returns, over-accumulation of capital, and so on. The second cut Marx takes at capital, as understanding it, is the temporal, the financial circuit. He cuts through that and looks at credit and fictitious capital. And basically what credit and fictitious capital also to a large extent does is it temporarily, like in time, displaces the valorization of surplus value, right? And through that process, sometimes is able to resolve a crisis. David Harvey takes the third cut. So he introduces a third cut in Limits to Capital, and that is a cut through the spatial process in the laws of motion of capital. Here he looks at concepts like uneven geographical development. I spoke about in my previous slide of how capitalism, in its attempt to over-accumulate or accumulate, and then in its attempt to resolve crisis, moves across the globe, right? Moves geographically from one space to the other space. That is a spatial process, and David Harvey is trying to understand that spatial process. Imperialism, colonialism, these are all parts, wars for example, these are all parts of a spatial process, and that is what Limits to Capital is about. Let's read another quote from Limits to Capital. He writes, it seems as if the crisis tendencies of capitalism can be set up sequentially, moving from from the general, that is example the falling rate of profit, to the temporal, here temporal is a financial, and to the spatial, that is uneven geographical development and geopolitics. It is wrong. However, to see the three cuts at crisis theory set out in limits as sequential, they should be understood as simultaneous aspects to crisis formation and resolution within the organic unity of capitalism. These are all integral concepts to capitalism. Just as the crises are inherent in the contradictions of capitalism, similarly, the way of how these crisis tendencies are resolved and how they move around the globe or in time or sectorally are all intertwined. And they are not sequential, they are simultaneous. That's an important point to remember. Coming back to the example that Marx and David Harvey in our lecture today have given, the example in fact that I started off the lecture with, the 2007-8-9 global financial crisis and China's role in it. I want to then come up with some, again, a map and a diagram here to show what Marx writes as the tendency to create the world market is directly given in the concept of capital itself. How so? So you see here the blue part in the pie diagram is China, and in 2010 China is producing 50% of the world's cement. Now all of this cement and steel, all of that is getting produced, is not all needed in China itself, and therefore the crisis of over-accumulation emerges in China. Now that has to be resolved. While the first crisis was resolved by shifting sectorally, this crisis is resolved by moving geographically, by moving spatially, and China's Belt and Road Initiative, one could argue, is one way in which this particular crisis is trying to seek a resolution. Now it is also important to remember, and Harvey reminds us, that because these contradictions are so inherent to the structure or the way capitalism is itself framed. Remember, we spoke about the contradictions between use value and exchange value. If you use something, then it is not available for exchange anymore, and you have to give up on the use value in order to gain exchange value. Several other contradictions like that exist, and in fact I could refer you to David Harvey's work, 17 Contradictions in Capital, would introduce you to, let's say, the contradiction in the form of money, or contradiction in the conceptualization of labor as a commodity, and several others. We are not going to go in that direction in this class, but it is important to remember that there are inherent contradictions within capitalism and that they are resolved through several different processes. They could be sectorial, these could be temporal, these could be geographical and spatial. And here I gave you an example following David Harvey of how there is an attempt to resolve this crisis. Since crisis tendency is such an important part or an integral part of the nature of capitalism itself, it doesn't go away. Any of these resolutions of crisis is only temporary. It is for the moment, it is for that space and time. It will just shift elsewhere, right? It might resolve in time, but then come back. If you keep producing a lot of cement, then there will be the crisis of over accumulation of cement, right? If there is a lot of production of something else, then and you're paying the labor very little wage, then there wouldn't be anybody to buy the product. Unused labor power, or what can be called too much surplus labor, can actually lead to a lot of political unrest in any country. And so all countries try to resolve these crises as and when they are manifesting themselves inside their borders. I put up some pictures here of just outside our IISER Mohali gate, a campus that I inhabit, and the transformation that we have seen around us is remarkable. When we moved in 2009 to the IISER Mohali campus, we did not have a boundary wall. There were agricultural fields in the fertile plains of Punjab that existed all around us. Then the airport road, a very wide airport road, came in front of IISER Mohali. We had a boundary wall, and eventually over the past decade or slightly more, what you see is massive urban development in that area, right? You see luxury apartments, condominiums, you see hotels, malls, cinema halls, all of that coming up. So David Harvey would see this as a form of spatial fix, as a place where capital is being temporarily parked in order for the capitalist to realize the surplus value, to valorize at a slightly later date. I will now introduce a few vocabulary terms that David Harvey gives us in Limits to Capital and also eventually in Condition of Postmodernity that help us understand capital or the laws of motion of capital as an inherently spatial process. So let's begin with what he calls historical geographical materialism. You will remember from Marx that we spoke about Marx's dialectical method, that of historical materialism. Harvey wants to insert the geographical aspect into it. He argues that you need to pay attention to how space itself is being reshaped in this process of dialectical shifts in history. Let's read the quote from him. To begin with, materialism of any sort demands that the triumvirate of space-time process, and when he's talking about the triumvirate, he's talking about space as absolute, or what we can refer to as the understanding of space as a container for social activity. Then space as relative, such as relative is, you can say that it takes X amount of time to reach place A and a Y amount of time to reach place B, but it can take a shorter time if you take a different mode of transportation, and therefore space can be relative, right? And the third is that space is relational. You understand space through its relationship with other spaces and through other social relationships. So this, he says, materialism of any sort demands that the triumvirate of space-time process be considered as a unity at the ontological level. They all act simultaneously. All questions about nature, including human activity, Whitehead once observed, can in the end be reduced to questions of space and time. There is unfortunately very little reflection within the Marxist tradition on the nature of space and time. This is a serious defect because historical materialism, or as I prefer to name it, historical geographical materialism, cannot exist without a solid appreciation of the dialectics of spatio-temporality. So here he really strongly argues for inserting the spatial in it, because without that, he says, you cannot really comprehend the process. Then he introduces another notion that he calls the spatial fix. This is, like I said, when capital needs to park itself at some point through infrastructure, through building in a particular geographical space in order to help with accumulation or to resolve a crisis moment. So spatial fix, David Harvey writes, the geographical expansion and reorganization of capitalism is one way to absorb surpluses, but it merely shifts the locus of contradictions from one place to another. So contradictions don't end, and crises are always coming in capitalism. Through this process of sometimes spatial fix, sometimes a temporal process, sometimes what we saw with the China example and the US example and the India example, sometimes labor is cheap somewhere and therefore capital moves there in order to garner more surplus value and so on. What gets created is what Harvey refers to as an uneven geographical development. For that, he writes, capitalism does not develop upon a flat, plain surface endowed with ubiquitous raw materials and homogeneous labor supply, with equal transport facility in all directions, right? The world is an uneven place, and capitalism draws upon that unevenness and then reshapes it yet again as uneven. It is inserted, grows and spreads within a richly variegated geographical environment. So these concepts are central to understanding how capital moves around in geography and in time. I'm going to end with this one more concept that Harvey calls time-space compression. Although he does not introduce it in Limits to Capital, although he does briefly allude to it, he develops it further in Condition of Postmodernity. But I think it's an important vocabulary to have when we are looking at a spatial way of reading Karl Marx. For this, he builds upon Marx's notion of the annihilation of space by time. Marx has argued that in Capital, let's read it only. He writes, while capital must on one side strive to tear down every spatial barrier to intercourse, that is to exchange and conquer the whole earth for its market, it strives on the other hand to annihilate space with time, that is to reduce to a minimum the time spent in motion from one place to another. With increasing technology, increasing modes of transportation, with the way financial capital moves, there is an attempt of capital to annihilate space with time. Now, many scholars, in fact, took this as space is no longer important in how we understand globalization, because Marx has argued that space has to be annihilated with time. Time is of consequence. All of these understandings David Harvey comes along and challenges. Let's end our lecture today with this quote. He writes in Condition of Postmodernity, by time-space compression, I mean processes that so revolutionize the objective qualities of space and time that we are forced to alter, sometimes in quite radical ways, how we represent the world to ourselves. With that, we end today's lecture. See you in the next one. Thank you.